Hey, my name is Carmen. I'm a motion designer and 2D animator and illustrator. And my artist name is Ohneweil, which can be translated as without reason. And for I.O., I make cover artwork and I make videos and basically visual stuff. I was at the SAE in Munich, where I became friends with Dyside and Material. And so I also got to know very quick Polygonia and all the other members of I.O. actually. And so that was the way we became friends. And when I.O. started, I just very naturally became part of it for the visual side, as they didn't have like a lot of people for that things besides Polygonia. Yeah, and that's how I got involved in I.O. Actually, my inspiration comes from everything that surrounds me, like of course nature, but also my daily life. I always am observing my surrounding, and that's where I draw my inspiration from. Also, of course, dreams and other artists, Instagram, haha. Yes, basically everything. When I work, I really love to get my hands dirty, and so I love to touch things and to touch color and paper, and so I really love to work analog and yeah, firstly sketch everything on paper and then just try things out and scan them, or take a photo of them and edit it digitally afterwards. And sometimes I also print that and add something on paper on it and scan it again, or things like that. So I really love to mix digital and analog things. Yeah, because it's super interesting, and sometimes I get a little bit bored just being on the screen. Yeah, so that's what I like for as a technique. That's a quite interesting question, because actually in my free time I'm not very into techno, so I wouldn't listen to it normally, as it's besides if I'm on a party then maybe, but I actually don't go so much to parties. So yeah, it's more like when I know I have to, or I am allowed to do an artwork for somebody, I try to kind of meditate on that music. So I listen to it sitting quietly somewhere, and sometimes I don't get it at all, and I'm like, why is it always the same? And then after some time I really get into it, and that's the point where I start to feel it, like when I really understand the contrast and the what it is about in that particular track or album. And then I immediately start to get some visual ideas, because I see something in this moment. So I'm like, oh, that's these kind of colors, or maybe these shapes, or maybe even this technique I want to use on it. And then I quite immediately start to do it and try things out. And yeah, sometimes when I don't feel it anymore during the process, I hear it again, or sometimes I hear it all the time during doing while I'm doing the artwork. And yeah, and that's how it develops. And yeah, and it's a lot of fun. So in my normal life, I use art as an expression for my thoughts, feelings, and everything. I think every artist does that. And so I kind of try to find a solution for my problems in an abstract way. So when I feel like this way, I just, need to put it out somewhere, and that's the way it looks like, and that's then a piece of art, I guess. Yeah, and I think that's why it's always different, because life is always different, and you always see yourself encountering different problems. And so it always changed. I remember when I pretty much started to do a lot of art, I did very dark stuff, and I don't know why, but it was all very, very dark and black and almost nothing. And right now I'm in a phase of my life where it's like very colorful, I guess. And it's not that I like color more than I still like sad things, but yeah, somehow this is fitting more to my life right now, and I think it will still change a lot till I will die. Yes. That's a really tough question, because first of all, I don't remember names, so that's really hard for me. And second is that I love a lot of artists, and as I'm also a lot on Instagram, it's like I don't know their names, but I follow them, and I love what they post. But I also, of course, love some artists, like more classic ones that don't post on Instagram, and that by now, like for example, Rothko. He has this amazing squares that just have like really small palette of colors, and yeah, and I just like how silent his work is and how calming it is for me. And also I will check on Instagram how their names are. There is one guy, for example, he's from London, apparently, and his name is Arran Rahimian. Sorry if I say the name wrong, but it's Ray Rahimian. Arran Rahimian. And he does amazing work, also very abstract and analog, and really beautiful and minimalistic. And another guy that I really love is Mitchell Johnson. He does very colorful stuff, also works analog. I really love paintings, so he works on canvas, and I think mainly his work is oil painting. And yes, these are three guys I love. Of course, I like Ghibli, Studio Ghibli. Like every film they make, I love it. My favorite is probably Spirited Away. And also I love Cartoon Network, also a lot of their stuff. I really adore Adventure Time, of course, and I think there was two, so the third could be a guy which I really I love his stuff, but I also look a lot of his tutorials, which is Ben Marriott. He does really great stuff, and he's a really cool guy, also 2D animation artist and motion graphic designer. Yes, and if you want to get better in After Effects, I can definitely recommend him. Das war's, ganz klar. Ja, ciao.
My name is Delusional Circuits, aka my real name Niklas Bühler, and I produce for IO under the pseudonym Delusional Circuits, and also I do all of the mastering and some Augur stuff. Yeah. So what's your question? I know the people from M.O.T.O for a very, very, very long time, like when I was 13 or 14 maybe, and we went to the same school, for example, David, Polygonia, and don't know about the other guys. And we had that drum and bass label, it was called Membran, and we tried to make some deep drum and bass music, which was pretty cool. And then our style changed a bit, and then we were like, okay, mainly David was like, yeah, we're gonna do a techno label, let's start. And then I.O. was born, and so we met up a long time ago and made some music, and O was just the consequence of us making music together and us deciding, well, we're going to do techno and it will be amazing. Yeah, it's kind of similar in every way. The first time I checked what is missing, like I just check it by ears. It's just like, okay, is there enough bass? Is there enough high end? It's just like having the first taste of the song and very quickly deciding what the song needs. It's not that I'm too technical about this, it's just about the sound and trying to understand the work the producer has done. And if that's cool, I just compare it with, for example, other songs from the album and stuff to make everything sound equal in a way and make it understandable. But I don't try to overemphasize my job as a mastering engineer. I just try to EQ everything correct, make minor adjustment to the dynamics, and like transport the production in a very clean way to the listener without treating too much of the audio. With pre-masters, the only advice I would say, don't clip it, obviously, and provide it in 24 or 32-bit. If you are not sure about whether you clipped it or not, provide it in 32 bits. And for sample rate, it's just like provide it in the sample rate you produced it in, and we're gonna change the sample rate afterwards, after mastering everything. So there are as less conversions as possible from sample rate and stuff, because then it keeps your audio clean and you don't have to filter your audio that much. Like, besides of the technical, more obvious aspects, there are also artistic choices you can make before sending it to the master, which will improve your work drastically. For example, being very concise about what frequencies are playing in the low end, for example. Decide what bass line you use and don't let it clash with the kick. And be very careful about what's playing at what moment. Don't play stuff at the same time in the bass, because these frequencies are so energetic, they tend to overlap and then kill your dynamics. So be very careful about what is placed where, and you should be able to visualize what is when. Like, these are your kicks, and in between there are the bass lines, for example, and sidechain. And if your low end is clean, you just have to make sure that everything above your low end, example 200 hertz and above, will be dynamically without too much sudden peaks, because this is going to affect the limiting process, which then will duck the bass line, which is bad. So the best thing you can do is trying to mix it as cleanly as possible so that the mastering doesn't have to do as much. For example, with Polygonia's productions, with most of the tracks I only have to do a little bit of soft clipping, making minor adjustments to the bass, like 0.5 dB, and that's it. It's just like making the sound of all tunes equal and no compression, nothing. It's just the mix stands for its own, and that's what I think is the most important. Don't be like, we fix it in a mastering. Take your time, just kick bass line, do it right, make the dynamics above very concise too, and then you will be fine during the mastering. I could speak about this for a long time. The most interesting thing is the normalization features from the streaming services. On streaming, I would say that loudness isn't that important anymore, but with club music, there's still, maybe unfortunately, a place for loud recordings. The first thing is it's always very hard to produce electronic dance music in a very dynamic way. It's mostly, if you don't even compress, it's already loud enough. But I would say on streaming services where there's normalization, I wouldn't try to master techno for streaming services in a like expanding the kick drum or something like this. This would be stupid. But on club music, the question is more interesting. But because I would say dynamic music sounds louder, but there is a big problem with dynamic music in club genres. That's because of the limiters the venues are using. For example, you have a limiter which is at 100 dB and you have a very dynamic recording. Your peaks will hit into the limiter, but at the same time all of the other stuff is too quiet. So you have to go very loud if you have a dynamic signal, and then you would be hitting the club limiter, and this would be sounding very bad and very ducked because the venue limiters are basically shit. So this might bring you to the conclusion that you have to master your audio very loud for club music. But if you haven't got a limiter on your PA that is like very, very near to the threshold where you're playing at, it's quite nice to have some dynamics actually, because it's better for the ear and nicer to listen for a long time. If you have a lot of dynamic range and your kick is, for example, like peaking at 106 dB and it's like very loud and very punchy, but the rest is like at 98, 99, it feels right, but it's also very loud. If you have a track that's just peaking at 100 constantly, it will be more hard to listen to it for a long time. So I would say for club music, dynamic audio is better, but the problem is that the venue limiters and the loud restrictions from the government, for example, are very tight. And if there is a limiter who enforces the very tight restrictions, you have a problem with too dynamic audio, because you have to make it obviously louder, because you want to have the same RMS value as the guys before you or after you. So yeah, loudness. To wrap it up, it's basically like that. If you are in an environment which is not about peak loudness, but more about loudness over time, always use the dynamic one. It will be louder, better for the ears and better for the audio. But if you are facing restrictions like absolute peak values you can't you can't clip, then you have to go a little louder and maybe use a limiter or two. Yeah. Yeah, this is a really good question, because I started doing professional mastering by mastering all of the I.O. discography. So before I just mastered my own recordings, and I was always like, oh, I really like this craft, I want to learn it. So I decided to master all of the I.O.'s catalog, and basically it was a very good experience, because every producer is different, of course. Like Material has different bass section than Polygonia, Dysart has a different bass section, but you kind of try to find a good way to be able to express all of the recordings in your measures. What I mean by that is you have like a kind of frequency spectrum which is like normal for techno and very helpful for DJs if you keep that frequency spectrum and dynamics. So what you want to do is like balancing every record you get and every song you get on that record to kind of meet the same requirements as best as possible. So for example, most producers have too much low end in their productions in pre-masters. Some producers have weird equalization, and you tried always not to change the way the producer meant the work. That's very important. You can think of it as you know what's right in a technical way, but some producers have, for example, stereo bass and super weird stuff, and you try to make it technically correct, but then you kill the idea of the producer. This is not the right way. These technical measures and restrictions are only working if you understand the artist's work and then put it in some way to these technical restrictions. But if you overdo it, the work will be worse than before, even if it's technically correct. So be very careful about that. And what I learned from this is really listening very close about what the producer meant, because at the beginning I was like, if a bass line sounded muddy, for example, I tried to very surgically filter it and make it right, but I always end up destroying everything, and the producers weren't happy about that. So what I just did is accepting it and making everything consistent sounding on the album, and this works out very good, and you don't have to do that much with the audio. So it's always good not to do that much with the audio, but especially if you master a lot of records, you kind of get used to this. Yeah, I don't have to use everything on every track. You just make 2 or 3 decisions and they have to be it. Otherwise you would over-process and make it worse than it should be. And it's very good mastering different artists in the same genre, because you learn a lot about who is doing what and how to overcome these problems. Okay, this is a very tough one. I'm not the equipment or plugin guy. I don't define myself about what I use, but I have some tools I find myself using all the time. So the first thing is like my favorite limiter. It's very cheap, but it's also the best I could find for me. It's called Tokyo Dawn Records Limiter number 6. There was a free version by, I think he's called Vlad G Sound, and he made the original Limiter 6, and it was very great. And I just added some features in the TDR limiter, and it's a very nice tool because you have different stages of limiting. You have a compressor, you have a high frequency clipper, you got 2 normal clippers, yeah, you know this. Clippers, and a peak limiter, which is oversampled. So you can be very small on every stage and just filter 1 peak on every stage, and the end result will be so loud without you having to do anything. It's really great because the dynamics are very clean afterwards. The other 2 tools are very hard to decide. I try to pick the more interesting ones. Any soft clipper would do. I really like soft clipping over compression. So I would suggest you the D16 group Devastor 2, or it's a free one, all of the saturations by Air Windows. It's a very great plugin developer. My 2 favorites of the saturations are NC17. It's a very, very strong, muddy, but also deep sounding soft clipper. And the second one would be kind of cleaner. It's Channel 8. Yeah, it's Channel 8 by Windows also. And it's better for emphasizing overtones on your bass drum and making your bass a little bit more round by shifting the frequency spectrum, like putting the bass a little bit down and pushing everything like between 80 and 200, which gives it a little bit more attack and makes it better for club speakers in a way. So these are my favorite distortions. I know I already mentioned 3, but EQ, use what you want. Yeah. And if you are really lazy about rendering and you really want to be as fast as possible with doing all the technical stuff, I would suggest you looking into the Reaper DAW, because Reaper is very good about mass rendering and batch processing. And if I have to master a record with about 20 tunes, it can be very nice to have a tool which is just able to make render queues, supports wildcards for naming your tracks and all that kind of goodness. So yeah, to wrap it up, I would say Limiter 6, favorite limiter by Tokyo Dawn Records, and Air Windows for every saturation from Air Windows you can get. Really, saturation is always nice. And the last one is Pick a DAW, which helps you rendering your stuff very quickly. Otherwise, you need more time for doing your work, and nobody wants that. Yes, quite a lot. The most important thing I learned is that I don't have to process that much before I master, especially with kind of compression, because I always wanted it to be super loud and being a banger and all of that stuff. But what I learned from mastering is just good decisions in production lead to good masters, and if you have bad decisions in your production, the mastering engineer will be screwed. So what you can do is, like I said earlier, it's a matter of cleaning your frequencies and being very concise about what frequencies you use. I learned this a lot from mastering my own tunes, because normally when you master your tracks, it's like you put some saturation on it in the master stage, and then you will be like, okay, there's some frequency scratching, and then you know, oh, the hi-hat is too loud because it's now scratching, or the bass is saturating too quickly and you can't even hear the highs. So I tried to be able to pre-mix it so that the limiting process is as good as possible for the material. And the way I do this is, for example, the only thing I really compress and limit in the production stage is putting the bass line and the kick and some drums into a bus and limiting this to make it really punchy. And in the mastering, I just use a little bit of limiting to make it sound, not even to make it sound more right, I guess, but just to have constant peaks for DJs in a way. But the most important thing is, I would say, not trying to compensate that your own work sounds not loud enough for you. Because the main problem is when you're producing, you're always like, okay, I heard the kick for like an hour. Now it becomes boring. It should be great, right? So you put a limiter or a compressor on it and you try to make it sound better, but actually you just know how it sounds. It's boring now, so you're making it worse by processing it. And the trick is here, just accept the signals as they are and say, well, it's a pre-master, I just focus on the music. And then if you say, okay, now it sounds boring, I want it to be more present, then you just put a limiter on it during the mixing stage. Look if the frequencies are okay, look if there are any peaks you don't know where they come from, and if the limiter is doing your signals a favor, or the saturation you use, everything you use for dynamics, if they're doing your signal a favor, then you did a good mixing job. If the limiter has weird peaks, the saturation doesn't sound good, then you gotta fix it in the mix. And if you did this, don't forget to turn off your chain on the mastering. But having a mastering chain to be able to know what is missing or what is not missing, more importantly, in your audio for testing is very, very important, and for me crucial, because I don't slap that much in the productions. If I know, okay, sounds boring, I just put a limiter on it. Now it sounds fat. Okay, I don't have to add another element which will kill my mix. And then I accept it, turn the limiter off, and I can go on producing. So it makes it very easy to have conscious decisions about what to put in the track. And that makes the mixing and the mastering very easy and the sound very present and good.
after 2 years making music alone in my flat, I meet Dyside, and he lives in a flat where there was some of the I.O. crew actually already, and we always make music together. And this time we got the label Membran, where we released some drum bass and bass music. And then I moved to Berlin, and after a time where I start to make techno and they start to make the label I.O., on some point Polygonia actually contact me and say you should release right now. So I was inside. I start to make music actually with my guitar. I play the guitar in a small cover band or something for I think 7 years. And then I was a bit tired about playing with a band, and I wanted to getting a loop machine, like those pedals with the 4 channels where you can loop stuff. But they was super expensive, so I was like, no, I getting an interface and Ableton. And then slowly I start to put the guitar more to the side, and yeah, got a bit addicted on Ableton. Yeah, after 12 years Ableton, I start to get some cash together, and then fall into the rabbit hole of Eurorack. So now actually I make my music only with the Eurorack systems. I arrange my tracks in this way that I have like different outputs from my modular system. So like my kick, my snare, my bass line, all the stuff is separated in at the moment in 10 channels. I want to get more actually, but this 10 channels then goes into my interface, so I can record them in stems in Ableton, and then I can make a little bit of post-production on it, like fade-ins and fade-outs, using sometimes a bit of effects, plugins and stuff then on top. I think my Eurorack system involves with the modules that I put in and out, so that's actually what creates the sound that I have. But I use a lot of filter swipes and filter modulation. I guess that's really a big point. A lot of delays, and yeah, I have this like Swayman SM1 that is actually a big point of the sound that I create, I guess. Yeah, okay. For working, I actually make my money with like live streaming and video productions. So in this case, I learn a lot about this. And personally, next to my music, I have a YouTube channel where I teach how to produce music, mix and master that stuff, and also, yeah, a bit of music industry, some stuff that I would love to know when I start. Das war's.
Hey, I'm Robin. I'm making music under the name of Kaf for IO Records. And there's not much else I do. I was making music since very early on with Dave. So actually we started a label doing drum and bass stuff, and then eventually he switched to techno, and since I was doing ambient and some sort of techno, I switched as well, or I was invited to join the family, which I'm really glad I did. My inspiration is basically most of the time nice images that come to mind of nature and exoplanets and universe and all the pictures that are kind of big and have like this huge impression and impact on the small human being. And so it's not so much related to any human emotions, I'd say, or interpersonal stuff, but rather like big pictures, nature, establishing shots from movies and that kind of stuff, yeah. I don't do any visual arts yet or currently, but besides music, I'm doing a lot of sound design and technical sort of sound related stuff, playing several instruments, and yeah, but you could say mainly music based. So the typical cuff sound is probably a mixture between synthetic and organic sounds, like field recordings that you catch with your field recorder going out in nature and then working with them, and using a lot of organic sounds that sort of give also this organic feel and separate it from being just industrial type of techno stuff, and it sort of has more like a not so dance floor character, but more natural vibes, which I try to express at least. In the last release, there was also more of these darker vibes, and lots of them came from really low resonators and bass lines, which have a sort of a different vibe to it. It's still organic to me, but it's definitely a synth-based technique. And yeah, this is what I end up with. All right, so the arrangement is most of the time started as loops, obviously, and trying to figure out the essential bits of the track. And then I have a huge feeling to try to take the listener to a certain journey and surprise in some moments. So either a lot of it has to do with complexity, stacking up stuff, and then reducing to minimalistic types of parts. And since hypnotic techno always or most of the time has these slow progressions, I find that is kind of it's a nice chance to play with all sorts of dynamics, whether it be high frequencies, harmonic stuff in comparison to rhythmic material, being complex in comparison to being really minimalistic and cold. And I think therefore some sort of a landscape arises in the track, and you can basically look far ahead and see the horizon, which are some harmonic elements in the back, as opposed to the foreground, which might be hi-hats and kick drums and elements which show up just event-based. So every once in a while there will be a loud snap with a huge reverb tail, and that sort of gives this 3D landscape to me. And I try to take the listener through this journey by changing all the time or every once in a while. Oh, yeah. Obviously the mixture of both is key to me. I think dry synthetic sounds always have a certain emotion to them, and they are a bit cold and neutral and sober, maybe even. So this has some aesthetic qualities, but the rich complexity is basically done by the organic sounds, taken from nature, taken from weird experiments, voice, yeah. So I couldn't prefer any of these. I'm using the Prophet Rev 2 a lot, since this is just a beautiful analog, perfect equipment for making pads, for making also weird sounds with huge resonances in the cutoff, in the filter section. Then I have this MS-20, and this does a lot of the bass lines and the noisy bits. And I use the audio source Ventris reverb, which is amazing, and does these endless infinity landscapes. And since everything is sort of in one setup and influencing itself, that's basically, I just record the output and I don't re-record. So most of the time it's happening as a jam and as a free musical journey, and then I select bits of it and rearrange them and tweak them, and yeah. Yes, I do. Actually, I wanted to become a film composer once, and I was fascinated by these. It's probably also the fusion between big picture and big sound, and what arises, like the feelings they make you feel really small, and the working of both together is just more than one of those could do it by themselves. And therefore I am strongly linked to movie soundtracks. I listened to lots of them in years before. And when discovering like ambient music, and modern movie soundtracks sort of tend to be ambient as well. So both blend into each other, and I found hypnotic techno to be a perfect genre to actually integrate these kind of musical journeys within the electronic music domain. So there are long transitions, and there are possibilities to build up harmony over 3 to 6 minutes, and you can have these big clashing chords, or you can be really minimalistic, and yeah, therefore the link is extremely given, of course. So actually, I'm not really listening much to techno and electronic music currently. I used to, but nowadays my focus shifted on more acoustic instruments. I like the movie soundtracks, obviously. I like the classical Spanish guitar pieces, and obviously when it comes to electronic music, there's so much. There's experimental music, there's ambient, and that kind of stuff is really nice to listen to. But the focus on techno itself is not really. I'm not so much going to parties. I'm not so much into DJing or having this kind of vibe, and I also try to not integrate the necessity to have these kinds of vibe in the music. So I'm actually, there are some really important hypnotic techno artists I'm listening to, and they're a huge inspiration. But the field is really broad, and I couldn't really tell what I'm listening most of the time. That's just a mixture of all, and all of these pieces are probably found in the inspiration, which then goes into hypnotic techno again. So some of the artists I enjoy in the Spanish guitar domain are obviously Francisco Tárrega, Leo Brover, and Carlo Domeniconi. There is Long Fern, and then there's this huge playlist where I collect all this stuff, and there's not a particular one that springs out, I'd say. And when it comes to movie soundtracks, I listen to so much Howard Shore, obviously Lord of the Rings. Hans Zimmer is a huge guy, obviously, then James Newton Howard. These are obviously the bigger ones, but yeah, I think to name the most important ones, everything that's sort of nearby. There are so many more right now sitting in remote control, the Hans Zimmer studio, Lauren Balfe, I think. So yeah, all this big orchestra style, I think, has been a huge impact to me, but I don't really dig it right now. But you can still probably feel it, that this is the vibes that I try to express a little bit. Well, not going directly into that direction, but still like big picture. I like that feeling of it.
Wow. Okay. Gather round, children, for a tale. No, I mean, in all seriousness, it was through you and through your work through Polygonia in particular. I was on SoundCloud just trolling music, as I usually did back then, especially when I was DJing more and sort of putting together the set. And I like to just kind of see what people were making, how they're going about it. There's so much material to go through, and a lot of it's tremendously inspiring, and a lot of it's very odious and time-consuming. So it's kind of the luck of the draw and how much your stamina can hold up at any particular session. But I was just kind of going through it, and I found, I don't even remember how I actually found your work. I think it might have been through Persian Empire. And Sam and his lot, and I got a link to one of your tracks, and I was just kind of really taken away and transported by your facility with texture in particular. It was just so confident and so clean and so well put together and arranged that I was like, man, I gotta roll the dice here and just reach out to this particular person and see if they'd be interested in collaborating in any form. And I hadn't really done that remote, so. In a nutshell, that's pretty much how I got involved with IO. So it was, I mean, if you're asking me what the trigger is in terms of what really started me on the path of writing, specifically poetry, it would be because of my older sister, Emily. And not to put too fine a point on it, but she really did teach me how to be a human being. Everything that I learned about empathy, kindness, art, creativity, being sensitive, and that being kind of okay, was because of her. And for that reason, she's like quite literally my hero. She's one of the best people I've ever known. And I feel very lucky to have had that experience and that exposure, because the culture within which we grew up in doesn't necessarily put a premium on these kind of displays of vulnerability, and also taking your creativity at its face value. That you kind of moved in so many different directions more often than not, and there's so many voices from outside that are trying to make you be artistic in a specific way, and not necessarily allowing you to be upset, to be angry, but at the same time to be quite interior and quiet and silent and individual in your approach, because it's such a communal culture. So that's pretty much what started. My sister would write these poems, like, when she was like 14, like 15, like really angsty teen poems, like why is the world so bad? Like these real these very, very effusive teen drama poems. But I looked at her and I took her dead seriously. I didn't see it as silly. I didn't see it as anything other than a true expression of how she felt at that time, and that she had the courage to put it on paper, one, and two, I felt very privileged, distinctly privileged, that she'd share it with me. So I was like, I got to try do this. I mean, it seems she gets so much out. And seeing it on the page or listening it to in the headphones or seeing it on screen, you can kind of see your own self in a different way, from a different perspective. And it helps basically with self-understanding and self-acceptance. Oh, wow. I like that question. And again, if I was to answer in full, I think we could be here for like maybe 300 years. But the truth is, I like things, genres, sort of modes of expression that have a kind of high sense of intensity. I really like when I encounter art, music, whatever it is, that feels like it's really struggling to contain itself in. That regardless of how effusive that expression is or how restrained and controlled, that there's this kind of rumbling energy underneath it that like can't really be contained or fully expressed even at its loudest or at its quietest as well. You know, so there's so many different, I draw so much inspiration from film, I draw so much inspiration from music as well, from literature. And more often than not, the texts that I cite as examples are kind of, at least for me, brimming, like they're almost bursting at the seams, barely held together. And there's not a fear in that. There's kind of a glorying and a celebration in excess, and in something resembling like an intensity of excess and an excess of intensity. How these things are constantly gesturing out there. This is not to say that it can't be refined and well arranged and put together. I think of people like David Lynch, for example, who's pretty weird to most people, but there's such a sense of craft and a sense of technique that he actually brings to bear in presenting all of these weird, surreal images and moments. But it's got this feeling to it. It's kind of eerie, a little spooky. It's kind of magical and otherworldly. It's kind of primal. In the sense that it's quite naive on the one sense. It feels quite simple. And if you hear him speak, for example, he sounds like a kid. But at the same time, I don't know, the kids have like such a propensity for cruelty and kindness, and they're kind of iddish in that way. That it's what it is when it is, and there's no guile or pretension or even sort of withholding or restraint. So I like that tension between, being understood and being honest to that feeling and trying to sort of run it down as hard as you can. Oh man, yeah, totally. Sometimes it's very interesting because there's lots of instances in which I experience what I just tried to describe, like a situation or a scenario in which it's just kind of thrumming with this energy that's very, very difficult to contain. And sometimes I feel myself impelled to try and sit down and not necessarily capture it, but kind of ride alongside it, to be around it and be with it, not over it or underneath it, but very much be a sort of a participant in some form or other, or a witness at the very least. And sometimes it just doesn't work. There's instances like in which I have a conversation with someone. It can be a quiet moment, but it can be such an intense conversation, even if it's simple. It's like, oh man, I love jelly beans. It's like, cool. But there's something about the way in which those ideas and that sentiment is expressed. And I'm like, this is just so full of something resembling the energy of truth itself, which is just one of those things that's undeniable. When you see it, you see it. When you feel it, you feel it. And it kind of calls upon you in a way that you can't deny. And attempts to do that will kind of drive you mad in a way, or leave you really unfulfilled. So there's so many instances when I have encounters of that kind where I try and sit down and write and nothing comes. And it feels like in those moments in which like that intensity is too much, that I lack the skills, or I lack the verbiage, the apparatus, the form, the technique, or the lack of all those things to kind of participate on the page. So I might, make a beat, I might read something, I might watch a film, or I might just imagine and be in different ways. And that's the beauty of art. It's so polyvalent. There's so many different ways of trying to participate with that feeling of intensity. But sometimes it does work. Sometimes I'm like, oh man, I saw a thing, I felt a thing, I heard a thing, I witnessed a thing, and I just sit down and it just kind of comes out. And in those instances, I really don't like to, I like to sort of like pull out the old, like, the sort of Hemingway, Bukowski technique, the sketchy dudes, but like the idea of, writing drunk and editing sober. So like when that feeling kind of hits you, to sort of like in so many ways be transported by it, be ensconced or drunk on it, and just let like be a conduit, so to speak. Let it move you, be a medium of it, be it like a lightning rod. Let it course and run through you, and then tomorrow deal with like the form and whether it makes sense, or whether you can trim it up and neaten it in a way most films are made in the editing room, much in the same way that, you know, after you do a session, you know, a singer comes in and is like, cool, play me the track. And then they sing and then like, peace, and then they leave. And you have to figure it out. You know, you have to figure out what works, what doesn't. So that kind of, but I don't think that you can actually, you know, you can't get the best out of it if you don't allow yourself, if you don't succumb or submit to those intensities of feelings. And sometimes it works. Sometimes a bunch of stuff comes out. Other times not a peep. So, yeah. Oh, like 1,000, like 1,000. Insofar as my own practice, for example, I do both. I also watch a lot of cinema, and more often than not, what it is, one of the first things that I notice about cinema, regardless of what genre, regardless of what era or epoch, is the dialogue and the soundtrack. So how it was written and what it sounds like, as opposed to what it looks like. That's not to say that what it looks like is unimportant, but it's so intermingled with these other things that I can't really separate and basically give one a higher premium than the other. But so in my mind, these things are inseparable from one another. I spend a not small amount of time, like most people, listening to movie soundtracks as opposed to albums. Or at the same time, like, you know, I've been listening to a lot of this rapper called Mike from New York, this kid out of New York. And a lot of people complain about his production. They find it really difficult to listen to musically, but they can't deny the bars. They can't deny how talented he is as a rapper, as an image maker, using words. So it's these interesting, it's what it is that you kind of latch onto. But insofar as the merger of literature and music, there's so many connections that I myself make all the time. Like I made like a weird kind of symphonic suite, which was inspired by a piece of Milton's Paradise Lost. I was like, well, if I was to score this, like in the sort of movie in my head, in my Kopfkino, like how would I go about, like, how would I go about scoring this? What would it sound like? What would be an honest and personal reflection of how deep and intense and broad like this Miltonic epic is? So there's so many what we could call cross-pollination, where, you know, a scene inspires a sound inspires a word, and round it goes. That's very interesting. So when I was a kid, I grew up speaking, for like the first part of my life, I grew up speaking Sotho, which is my mother's language, Sesotho, tiny little landlocked country within South Africa's borders. It sounds a lot like Bedi and Zwana, so there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination insofar as culture and ideology and practices and language, obviously between these three and others, of course. But we were sent to English-speaking Anglican private boarding schools, so we lost it. And English replaced any other sort of quote-unquote mother tongue as the primary language that me and my sister speak. So if you ask me what languages do I speak now, English, pretty much exclusively. I have like poor tangential, but I mean, I have understandings of Sotho, but to express myself in Sotho is kind of a little difficult. It's getting worse and worse. Like the further away from South Africa I move, and the fewer sort of Sotho people that I interact with or encounter. And then, like a couple words in German here, a couple words in French there, but English is the primary one, yeah. Yeah, no, I write in English primarily and only. And what I like to do, I like to think about that sometimes, to ask myself, well, if I knew another language, would there be another just vantage or lens or facet of the prism of expression that I could basically make use of to try and express an idea, this intensity of feeling, which more often than not demands to be voiced in every single possible language that would be available to me, or every single style, or every single medium or genre. And I think it's something that I certainly want to work on, to be a polyglot, but this takes time as well. Like learning a language is like learning math. It's something that you got to do, like you got to practice all the time. So, or music for that matter, there's obvious parallels between, language, mathematics, and musical notation. And I think the sort of approach to acquiring the skills in these particular regards, to acquire these lexicons, mathematical, linguistic, or musical, requires like super dedication. And at this point in time, you know, I think aside from trying to survive, like it's rather difficult to sort of make the time. But I do think about how I do use the English language, and a lot of people who've read my work, you know, the work that I've been grateful enough to have published in and through IO and commissioned to do, is followable. But I mean, there's a lot of like my personal pieces and whatnot that a lot of poems that have shown other people that are like, I don't know what's going on. It sounds really weird and like kind of in a way not dissimilar to something like we were talking about earlier, like free associations in jazz, like in the sense of kind of really taking things out of context that you might be familiar with and kind of just smashing them together in really weird ways to see what song they can sing or what sound they can make. That's such an interesting question, because I think this brings into sharper focus the nature of the assignment, or what it is that you're writing for and the audience that you have in mind. And when I think of an audience insofar as the writing that I've done for IO, I don't really have anyone in mind save you or anybody sort of in the upper staff who might be, you know, who might put some eyes on it. But that doesn't necessarily, you know, because sometimes, you know, when you know you have an audience, it kind of freaks you out, makes you a little bit nervous, and you might not necessarily express yourself fully. So I try not to think about audience as much as I can. I certainly hope that the audience would be receptive or at least open to what's being presented to them. But if I don't, it's not a question of whether I care or not. I just don't really have the time to think about it. I'm trying to sort of focus on getting it true, not right, but true. And then what happens after that, it belongs to the world. Like, cool, I have a feeling about it, but you know, Tom, Dick, or Harry can basically be like, I love it, hate it, yeah, I'm neutral. So it's at that point in time, I've disabused myself of the notion that it belongs to me in any kind of way. So the audience is the audience. But when it comes to the sort of assignment itself, more often than not, I'm responding to sound. I'm responding to an accumulation, a collection of tracks. And what I do is I try and sort of have a pen out and I listen to it once. If the first listen is the same listen, then I actually have the pen out and just like take down a couple of ideas. So in that sense, it feels kind of direct and immediate in the sense that I don't really have enough time. Well, I try and cut out the amount of time that I have to overthink things. So to actually have it as immediate as possible is how I go about it. And more often than not, the change in the song, the percussion, they might be arising sort of, string bit in the beginning. And obviously these are technical tracks, so like they're quite long. So you got a joint that's like 7-8 minutes. Like the first 2 minutes is just real ambient and calm, and you're like, oh wow, I'm having these types of feelings and seeing these images and having this kind of sensation. I see and feel these particular colors, and then all of a sudden, you know, the drums drop, and you're like, oh word, no, it's completely changed. So this kind of the arrangement of the stanzas, and I suppose the manner in which they flow on from one another, reflects in so many ways my experience of actually listening to the track from start to finish. And then that basically, you know, those different stanzas arranged, it's almost like songs in a playlist in so many ways, and how it describes in total the experience of listening to the record as a whole. Damn. Wow, dude. That's intense. Writers. Okay, well, okay, so I'll give you 2 writers in a book. Does that work? Because I like this book, and I've read some of his other work, which I was like, it's good, but it's not as good as this one, or not as impactful to me as a person. So the book is The Island of the Day Before by Umberto Eco. Fantastic book. And the 2 writers will be John Milton and Gerard Manley Hopkins. Poets, both.
So what do you like about them or this book in particular?
Well, this book, what I like about it, I like the central conceit, which is the précis of the novel, is that it's a kid who's shipwrecked on a ship. It's a full Spanish galleon, and he's the only person on board, or so he thinks. But it's too big a ship to sail by himself, and it's too far away from this island. It's very near this island for him to swim. So he can see it. He's basically stranded on this ship in this very interesting way. And it's just a series of flashbacks about his life and how he got there. And along the way, Umberto Eco like engages with all these crazy ideas of, you know, machines and meaning and history and coming of age and all of these things. There's also a really interesting passage, an extended passage about the Court of Miracles, which is this underground catacomb city. You might have seen it in like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is based on Victor Hugo's retelling of it. But this idea of a society, like the mirror opposite of society above ground, where they have their own kings, queens, jesters, they have knights, so to speak, they have highwaymen, but it's all like slightly different. It's like the David Lynch version of like reality, but underground. And I love it. I think it's so cool. It's so interesting. I'm interested in like subterranean vaults and phonic places and catabasis and sewers and abject spaces. And it's so cool, like how he brings that into the story as well. So it's a very rich text. It's very, very rich. Maybe too rich. Maybe it's like a really dank piece of chocolate cake, but I love chocolate cake. So, I mean, Gerard Manley Hopkins, he's my favorite poet. An Englishman, I forget when it was, 19th century sometime. And he developed this thing called sprung rhythm. And it's so musical, it's so lyrical. It sounds like he's rapping in so many ways. It's so alliterative. He's got all these, you know, literary devices. He's got all these spondees and everything it feels so alive, his poetry. And I mean, he's mostly trying to talk about the glory of God. He was a priest. He was a queer priest at the time and was subject to so much revulsion and persecution. But what he was trying to do in so much of his poetry is to describe this massive love for this thing that, like, love itself in essence, as God, but in all sorts of different things. But the way he goes about trying to do something impossible feels so like alive and like really brimming with energy and intensity. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, beautiful poetry. I love it. And Milton, I mean, again, it's these people who try and do these like impossible things. You know, there's a kind of like hubris, a kind of arrogance to be like, but at the same time, a belief, and in so many ways being pushed beyond your own doubts about your ability to do the thing, that like you're just moved by it, that you have to try at the very least. And, you know, I read things, I remember reading things like Paradise Lost, and I was just like, damn, this is wild. This is such an intense reach beyond yourself and what you're even capable of as a human being that you know, but you still try anyway. And that's why I like those two writers, Milton and Hopkins. Ooh, wow. Damn, man. I'm rather hesitant to answer this one by virtue of the fact that I don't necessarily believe in prescriptions. I believe that if you feel that you're compelled, if you're, again, this kind of weird nebulous energy that's just jumping around in you and pushing you and bending you, and you can't turn it off, you can't deny it, regardless of how much you might try. Can't ignore it. And I think if it's trying to manifest itself or feels as if it's pulling you to a page and a pen, then find a page and a pen and see what happens. And I think one of the things that is most difficult to do for somebody who wants to do something is to sort of remove themselves from the equation, to try and not get in your own way. And this is why I really believe in sort of submitting yourself to that energy. It might be scary because it might feel overwhelming. You might feel that you're expressing yourself in ways that like kind of freak you out a bit. Like, man, I didn't even think I was capable of like saying that out loud. I didn't, it's so interior and private. And I think that scares a lot of people. But if you can find the courage to pursue the truth in you and how it's trying to sort of pursue itself through you, then, you know, if it's leading you to a pen and a paper, pick that up and just try and tell the truth. Don't try and do anything other than that. With music, for example, I'll listen to like a Flying Lotus beat or something and be like, dude, I want to make, I I want to make a beat like that. And what I failed to realize is actually that I want to make something that makes me have that same level of intensity, that feeling. It's not the beat, it's not the form, it's not the technique, it's the feeling that it produces. And that's what I'm really interested in. That's what I'm chasing. So I'll be like, nah, cool, I'm gonna get all these samples out. Oh, it sounds like there's like all these, shakers and what. I'm gonna get all that jazz. And I'm gonna open 40 channels, I'm gonna lay it all out in the samplers, and I'm gonna be like, all right, let's put it together. And then I'll try and I'll try and I'll try, and it just feels dead. It just feels untrue. And then I'll, have a glass of wine or smoke a J, and then just kind of chill out, calm down a bit, and just be like, what samples do I have here? And just kind of like let the samples in so many ways speak to you. Like, and also to take risks. And at that point in time, I mean, if you're like a little blitzed or whatever, I'm not saying that people should go out there and get high and get drunk. Like, that's the not sustainable way to make art. It can certainly be helpful, but in the long run, oh yeah, it'll put you on the ground. But the thing is, what I think is important to notice in those situations is how unstressed you feel, how calm you feel, how relaxed. And that's, I think, the best way to try and make art. Not to say that it's like that all the time, but if you can, just kind of, chill out a bit. And you might just, just jump octaves or whatnot, and then just like press a button by accident. And it's just like, wait a minute. That's exactly what I was looking for. And then everything else just falls so neatly around it. It kind of makes itself if you don't get in the way. Oh man, I think I can actually come back to it in a spherical kind of way. We can begin where we started, and in so many ways begin where we're going. Because I think when it comes to Io, I mean, the first thing that came to mind was Greek mythology, Io, and so on and so forth. Dryads and naiads and all that. But what it means to me personally is basically this kind of idea of unrestrained creativity. To basically follow it where it goes, and to actually have a space curated by individuals who have the same ethic and ethos, who might be working a completely different medium or style, but who value your own pursuits and attempts at like being true in whatever form that is. And that's what that means to me, because I feel no sense of guile, I feel no sense of elitism, I feel no sense of a closed door. There's nothing foreclosed. Everything feels so bright and radically open. That it's kind of just like a real dance of life. It's a kind of, it reminds you of a sort of moonlit open night where you could go anywhere.